All right, everyone. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar that's hosted by the Home Builders Association of Virginia. We're glad to have members from across Virginia and beyond tuning in for what promises to be a very insightful conversation on the economy and housing. My name is Craig Tolson, for those that I haven't had the privilege to meet, and do have the privilege of serving as the CEO of HBAV. Before we get started, of course, we need to thank our special sponsors who make events like this possible. They are 84 Lumber, Annandale Millwork and Allied Systems, Builders Mutual, Dominion Energy, HBAV Insurance Agency, Kempsville Building Materials, and the Lester Group. So just a quick round of applause for that. We truly do appreciate their support and, again, their dedication to HBAV and the housing industry. Today, we are honored to have and welcome our nationally recognized economist, Dr. Robert Dietz. Dr. Dietz is the chief economist for the National Association of Home Builders. He's responsible for NAHB's economic forecasting, housing policy analysis, and all industry surveys. He's also the trusted voice on the trends and challenges shaping the home building industry and does many national interviews. You'll see him on a lot of national media outlets. So in just a moment, Dr. Dietz is going to share the latest national and regional economic data, key housing market indicators, and of course, an outlook for the months ahead and possibly the year ahead for builders, developers, and all industry professionals as we navigate the challenging market of today. We are going to share the slides to all registrants, so we will distribute the slide deck. And we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So please, if you'd like, just type your questions in the chat box, and we will answer questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to our speaker today, Dr. Robert Dietz.
Great. Thank you, Craig. It's good to join all of you. I'm sharing my slide deck here. I'm joining you from the wrong side of the Potomac River. I'm in Washington, D.C. today, although I live in Arlington, so this is very much my home state, HBA. And thank you to Craig and the staff team at HBAV for inviting me. The sponsors, there was a lot of familiar enterprises on that list that I've worked with. I've got a cold this morning. I'm not going to let that try to get me down. In fact, I was telling the team before we logged in that I changed the headline for this presentation from something that was a little more cautionary. It's been a down year for housing data. We've seen some weakness in some of the housing and home building numbers, but I think now that we've gotten through what I think is the worst of the uncertainty with respect to tariffs, and I'm not a fan of tariffs. I think it's a kind of a misguided way to raise revenue, but I think we've ended up in a better place through some of the trade deals and using tariffs as a negotiating position rather than an end goal of themselves. And in this morning, we got inflation data it wasn't great, but it was better than a lot of the professional economists have been talking about. And I think it sets us up for the Fed cutting in September. The Fed has been on pause since December. It's been too long. In fact, we have started to ramp up our pressure along with other groups on the Fed to get back to the easing path. They've been in this pause position. A lot of it has been attributable to tariffs and to a certain extent as a professional economist, I get that. But if you look at the incoming data right now, moving back into easing territory or an easing policy path is really where we need to go. So I got about 35 slides. Be thinking about questions. As Craig said, we'll make sure that the deck is available to you. We'll take some Q&A as we get through the talk, but we'll go ahead and get started here. And I thought we'll lead with some of the kind of the bad stuff. This is a survey of economic policy uncertainty. Now, uncertainty, if you're going to a better place, isn't necessarily a bad thing. Economists, we're paid to worry. We don't like change in the way that like a lobbyist embraces change and embraces the fight. Economists, we like certainty because we're plugging numbers in. And so you look at a graph like this and you say, oh, that's bad for capital investment. It's bad for businesses. But if there are policies to be changed, embracing uncertainty can be a positive thing. To be clear, the first quarter GDP numbers were not good, and it was really attributable to the fact that a lot of people just simply didn't know what the rules of the road were going to be. But that was something to be expected with Trump 2.0. Trump 1.0 was about kind of getting into office and learning the frustrations of government. Trump 2.0 is about utilizing those lessons to achieve things that Trump really believes in, things like illegal immigration enforcement. The border is basically now sealed, and tariff policy. And I disagree with him on tariff policy. I don't think you create wealth through taxes, but it is something he's believed for 40 years and is going to try. Now, to be clear, those higher taxes coming from tariffs led a lot of consumers to think inflation was going to rise. And in fact, back in April, we had the bond market really showing some real signs of distress. That pushed consumer confidence lower and did move a lot of consumers to the sidelines for big purchases. So this is things like buying a home and buying a car. That marginal buyer kind of moved to the sidelines and said, it's not necessarily that I'm not going to buy, but I'm going to kind of wait out and see how some of these negotiations, some of the political ebb and flow plays out. And the result was that consumer confidence fell. It's stabilized, but it is one of the reasons that we've seen some weakness in home buyer traffic during the months of April and May. And we did have an increase in inflation expectations. Now, the debate is underway on what tariffs do to inflation. The textbooks for economists, what they say in terms of the past is that tariff impacts are shared between exporters. This is kind of the Trump view. They reduce their prices to remain competitive. Where the economists are critical of using tariffs across the board is you can't get all the exporters cutting prices at the same time. There's no kind of benefit from that. Some of the cost of a tariff is borne by the importing businesses. They're the ones who actually write the check, but they don't necessarily have to pass along the full cost. And what's really interesting is over the last few months, about 2/3 of the cost of tariffs, at least according to some of the public reporting by larger enterprises, 2/3 of that cost is being borne by the businesses themselves, those importers. They're not passing along those costs. Now, they can't do that forever, but I think some of that is kind of a bet on maybe the tariffs will go away. There's court action that we'll see later this year, and whether the Trump administration's IEPA statute is valid. But some of them don't want the public attention of saying we're raising prices because the president's going to call them out on social media. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how that plays out. And then the last place where tariff costs can show up is higher consumer prices. And so that's what this chart is reflecting, those higher inflation expectations from consumers. And I've had plenty of people ask me this question, are the consumer surveys valid anymore? Look, there's some weakness with some of the consumer surveys right now. They are heavily politicized. If you're a pro-Trump Republican, your expectation on inflation is pretty low. If you're a Democrat and you don't like Trump, your expectation of inflation is pretty high, and that's a problem for us economists in terms of looking at the data. But that's where kind of the tariff effects are being born. To me, the big thing is the tariffs that were announced back in April, the Liberation Day tariffs, are nowhere near the tariffs that are in place. And that's a good thing because I think things like 145% tariffs on China would have resulted in some pretty significant increases in the prices of furniture, clothing, toys, other types of things that really come from China, and it would have affected ordinary households. So you can see at the end of that slide, some of those inflation expectations are giving way. That's a reflection of the deals that are being enacted. And I know those deals are only frameworks, they're not treaties, but they do take off some of the tariff risk. And that's really the uncertainty risk that we want to kind of ebb back, and that will help the overall economy. In terms of our overall look on GDP growth, the first quarter was not good. So if you look at that red vertical line on the slide, you can see that little blue bar that's negative. That's the first quarter GDP growth data. Now, I think that's going to be revised to a flat reading rather than a negative reading as we get additional data from the first 3 months of the year. But it represented a kind of a stall speed for the economy. Now, a lot of economists kind of went overboard on that, and we're basically saying, forget recession risk. We're in a recession right now. That was really premature. It was exaggerated. We've remained kind of in the same place that we've been for the last 6 months. We think a chance of an official recession for 2025 is about 30%. Now, in any given year, the baseline level of recession risk is only 15%. So going from 15 to 30 does represent an elevation, but it's nowhere near some of the discussions that economists had of 60, 70, or even 100% chance of recession guaranteed. We always kind of viewed the tariffs as negotiating positions and believed that as announced, they wouldn't go fully into effect. And that's what we've seen. Nonetheless, we have had slow growth here at the start of the year. If you look at the table, 2025, we've got growth right around 1.4%. We think it will be better next year, propelled by the big, beautiful bill and the certainty on tax policy and tax cuts. That's going to be good for the industry. But this year, you can call it disappointing, but it's kind of a year of policy transition. And one of the lines that Jim Tobin, NAHB CEO and our former chief lobbyist, likes to say is that we haven't really seen the Trump economy fully implemented. We're in the transition period of some of that ugliness of the sausage making in terms of trying to get there. So slow growth for the year. You can see those blue bars accelerating as we get in 2026. That's the tax cut benefit. And then we get kind of a more stabilization rate. 2027, you can see the growth falls off, but that's speculative at that point. I wouldn't take necessarily that number to the bank. The labor market remains in good shape. The unemployment rate remains closer to 4%. We do think it is going to rise a little bit. Some of that is government-related layoffs. That's going to affect, of course, the Northern Virginia market, some other government-dominated areas. But generally speaking, that's not a particularly big rise in the unemployment rate. I think at our max point, we've got it at about 4.5%. That's a really solid labor market. What we have seen, and this dates back to 2022, is that blue line coming down. The blue line is the job openings rate. That's a measure of the number of open, unfilled jobs in the economy. So you can think of that as the help wanted signs. That has come down, but that has come down due to the fact that 2022 marked the beginning of the Fed tightening monetary policy, raising interest rates, raising the cost of capital for businesses, and they weren't hiring as much. So the number of job openings has come down, but it's stabilized in the last 6 months. And it's stabilized not at those really artificial post-COVID levels, but at levels that we saw in 2018 and 2019. So the labor market still kind of lacks workers. We've got a lot of businesses that are kind of on hold right now. We talked about uncertainty earlier, and I think that is going to pick up, and we're going to see kind of a healthy level of hiring in 2026. The labor market, though, does have a group for whom conditions are challenging, and that's recent college grads. If you don't have 10 or 15 years experience right now, if you majored in something like computer science, there are simply no jobs being offered right now. And so we are seeing an uptick in the unemployment rate for those recent grads. It's too soon to attribute some of that to AI. That's coming. There are going to be some big structural changes over the next 5 years. It's not going to be a wipeout, but if you think about a company that's got like 10 bookkeepers or 10 tax accountants, it could be that in 3 or 4 years, rather than 10 employees, that group might only have 2, because they simply are going to be able to automate a lot of this stuff with these large language models. If you've used them, I'm sure most people have. I've used them to try to program, try to work with data. I've even used them a little bit to do some first draft writing. It's about 90% accurate. You really got to spend your time editing, but 90% could eliminate some positions as kind of a first pass. So that's coming. I think it's going to have big impacts on industry. And then if we think about the macroeconomy impacts for home buying demand. All right, I'm going to mix in a little bit of local data. The way you read this particular chart, if you look at that box in black up in the upper left-hand side, it says United States 105%. What that means is that compared to February of 2020, so right before the COVID drop and then the COVID recovery, U.S. employment growth now stands at a 5% higher level, hence 105. 5% higher level than it was in February 2020. And then you can see some of the local data here. We've got 2% gain for, whoops, sorry, was clicking something else. 2% gain for the DC area. The DC area is going to see a slowdown. That wouldn't be surprised to see that number drop down to the 100% level. So in other words, some job losses moving us back to those February 2020 levels. Virginia Beach at 102%. I just kind of put in some of the larger markets. Richmond is one of the leaders. You've got a 6% gain since the COVID era. So Virginia has seen growth. Not everywhere in the country has seen numbers that would put them above 100%. And in fact, in the case of Richmond, growth that is faster than the US in the post-COVID period. And then if you want a sense of state by state where the leaders are, the places in red, which does include DC, which matters for Northern Virginia builders, DC still has not recovered all the jobs that were lost during COVID. It's at this kind of 90% level. Hawaii is another example. But then if you look at the other end of the slide, you've got Idaho and Utah, clear leaders, markets that are up 14, almost 15% in terms of job growth. And Virginia is fairly close to kind of in the middle there if you're looking at the U.S. level of 105%. Virginia is in there with Washington and Minnesota and Kentucky kind of in the middle area, kind of trending along with the national numbers. But you can see those states at the end, Idaho, Utah, Florida, and Texas have seen a slowdown. But in terms of job growth, they are definitely among the leaders that we've seen thus far. Inflation, this is really going to matter for the Fed and where we're going. The CPI, which it's not the measure that the Federal Reserve tracks for monetary policy. That's the core PCE measure of inflation. But CPI is what everybody's familiar with. It's that kind of a 2.7, 2.8% year over year growth rate. So prices are still going up. We'd like to see that number come down to 2% to kind of complete the post-COVID inflation, kind of dampening that we need to get back to normalized monetary policy. But the challenge has been, and this has been the case for about 2 years, that the leading source of inflation for the U.S. economy has not been goods inflation attributable to things like tariffs. It's the item in red. It's shelter inflation. That's about 40% of the overall inflation measure. And shelter inflation measures rent and then a proxy for home prices. It's kind of complicated, something called owner's equivalent rent that kind of gets worked in the system. And what you can see is in the most recent data, shelter inflation still growing at a 3.8% year over year growth rate. Now, why? Because underlying construction costs have gone up so much. So that's caused rent and those homeownership costs to be higher. And the fact that we continue to have, despite the slowdown, a structural deficit, the shortage of housing units relative to the size of the population and the number of households. In fact, if that red line got down to like a 2.5% growth rate, overall inflation would be at 2%. The Fed could then cut literally by 200 basis points, which is what the president wants, and really kind of produce a nice little economic boom. So we have been arguing for quite a while. If you want to solve the inflation problem, make it more affordable for builders to build. Make the housing market more attainable. That will push down the overall inflation data closer to the Fed's 2% target. And that in turn means that the Fed could turn dovish. So then that builds up to the headline that we had. And I said the Fed rate cuts are on the horizon. Under the box in yellow, you've got the cuts that they did in 2024. Now, at the start of 2024, at the International Builders Show, when I did our forecast at the beginning of that year, I thought they would only cut twice. So I was frankly surprised that they cut by 50 basis points in September and another 25 right before the election. I mean, that was 75 basis points right before the election. I didn't think they were going to do that. And it wasn't even an economic argument. I just think it didn't look right. It looked like they were sort of kind of gunning the system here right before the election. Well, they did it, and they've gotten a lot of political flack for doing so. And so the result was 100 basis points of cuts in 2024. And I thought they needed to cut, so I wasn't necessarily going to complain. But then they went on pause for right now, all of 2025 that we've experienced. And that has been a problem. So I think They will cut again in 2025. We've already got two governors, Governor Waller and Governor Bowman, on the Federal Reserve's board that are going to cut. Stephen Moran, the President Trump's head of the Council of Economic Advisors, is going to take one of the positions that just opened up. I think we're going to see some other votes, and so I think right now 95% chance that they cut in September. And then our forecast, which for 2025 has been fixed now for about 9 months, we've not revised it. We think we'll see another cut in December at the end of the year. If you look at some of the bond market signals, they're suggesting through at least the first half of 2026, we'll get 4 rate cuts. So 2 at the end of this year and 2 more in 2026. That's exactly what we've had in our forecast. So we think we get 2 more in 26. So we're about to enter into a period, and you kind of see the red vertical line kind of masks it, but that red line, the Fed funds rate, is going to, over the next, say, 6 to 9 months, move down by about 100 basis points. That's great for builder loan financing, development loans, construction loans. It puts indirect pressure on mortgage interest rates. We will talk about some of the upward pressures that are a problem a little bit more, but generally speaking, I think we're about ready to enter into what the president's wanted. He's not going to get the size of the cuts he wants, but we're going to begin directionally moving in the right position for the Fed. So, what about long-term interest rates? Well, right now, mortgage rates are kind of in the 6.6, 6.8% range. Our forecast has always been that they will eventually begin to slow, but we keep pushing back the point that I think we'll get kind of a disproportionate benefit, which is when mortgage rates slip below the 6% level. And we had said, if you're watching me last year when I joined you, we thought, we'd get below the 6% range in early 26. Now we've pushed that back a full year. Now it's kind of the early 2027. So I think we're going to head in that direction. The Fed moving back into an easy mode is going to help. The challenge is if the Fed cuts too much on the short end of the curve, those short-term interest rates, that's what the Fed controls, it can send a signal the bond market doesn't care about inflation. And if inflation expectations go up, then the long-term interest rates, including the 10-year and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, can actually go up as the Fed lowers. And we don't want that. So doing this in a kind of a managed way, a slow way, a cautious way is definitely what is best for the industry, although it would certainly feel good to see a big rate cut like the president wants. But generally speaking, we think those long-term interest rates are going to move lower. And our consumer survey research indicates if we get near 6, some of that sideline homebuyer demand will come back in the market. Now, as we move into this kind of more, Fed cutting mode, the risk to higher interest rates moves from monetary policy and the Fed to fiscal policy and the size of the government's deficit. And in fact, the blue line is the debt to GDP ratio. So you can kind of think of this as the size of the federal debt compared to the size of the economy. They're roughly the same right now. We're kind of at 100% GDP ratio. That's pretty high. I mean, if you go back and you look at the start of this graph, we're going back to 2006, it was at 40%. So just during this period of the Great Recession and COVID, we've gone from 40% debt to GDP ratio to 100%. The only other historical example of that happening was World War II. And we certainly haven't gone through a major world war. So that's why deficit hawks are concerned. And if you see this projection, this includes the current tax policies, which we now assume are kind of the predictable look of federal income tax revenue. It includes some uptick in higher tariff revenue, but you can see what the debt to GDP ratio is doing as we move forward over the next couple decades. Social Security and Medicare spending skyrocket. There's other elements of the government's budget deficit, including defense. We're probably going to have a $1 trillion defense spending at some point. I don't necessarily think that's the wrong thing. In fact, I would argue it's probably where we need to be, particularly when it comes to naval spending. But that means that blue line is moving higher. Now, here's how you get where we want to be for housing. We need that blue line. It doesn't have to go flat. It just has to grow less quickly. And so to get that to be a little less steep, just restrict government spending to only growing 1% while the economy grows 2 to 3%. That's the trick. Get government spending to grow less quickly than GDP growth. And so if Congress, and hopefully this will be what the Trump administration works on during the second half of this second term, if we can just reduce that blue line steepens out, and that means a smaller debt, which means you don't have as many treasury bills and bonds entering the market, and then that puts downward pressure on mortgage interest rates. If this blue line skyrockets like what we're seeing here, mortgage rates are going to be a lot higher in the 2030s because those mortgage rates have to compete with treasury rates, and the treasury rates have to be higher if there's more debt outstanding. And to be clear, I know we sort of attack tariffs a lot because economists like me don't like tariffs, but let's remember why we got in the inflation mess in the post-COVID environment in the first place. It wasn't tariffs. It was the fact that government spending increased on a nominal growth basis. You can see this chart right here, 48% higher level of federal government spending than what we had in 2020. I mean, that is incredible. This should be on the news every single night. 48%. I'm not even talking about the stimulus era. You can see the two spikes of COVID, but just where we are on a kind of a routine basis, there's a lot of room to cut. And I know we all had hopeful ideas of Doge accomplishing things, and in the DC area, that was kind of a high stress thing in terms of people looking at their jobs and the like. But if we could just get some discipline when it comes to the federal government, we'll get a help in terms of mortgage interest rates. I've talked a lot about tariffs. I'm not going to go through all this data, but another source of revenue will be tariffs. Now it's pretty small compared to the income tax. We'll likely see tariff revenue run at about 10% or less of what we see for the income tax, but it's helping. And like we said, we not only need to cut government spending, but some additional revenue sources. But the impacts of tariffs are going to show up in certain parts of the economy. We've done some estimates surveying builders, and thus far, in terms of building material pricing, the impact on a single family home is about $11,000. To be clear, 40% of builders say they've seen no impact at all within the survey. So that 11,000 is concentrated among 60% of builders. But my hope is that even though I'm not a fan of tariffs, that we've kind of found the sweet spot, which is a little bit of an increase in the tariff rate, means some tax revenue that is being paid for by exporters overseas because they're cutting their prices of the good to remain competitive, but not such high tariffs that they act like embargoes. And that's the problem with the 145% impact on China. That if that had gone into effect, it would have had real effects on things like literally the nuts and bolts that go into building a home. So hopefully we've found what the new normal is going to be on the tariff regime, and that comes from a critic of tariffs. All right, so we talked about interest rates. What about home prices? I put up, again, this is all just relative to post-COVID. Richmond up 60% since COVID on the Case-Shiller data, 55% for the Virginia Beach area, 39% for Washington, D.C. I think this would surprise a lot of people. And we are definitely seeing weakness in home prices in the D.C. area. Maryland, West Virginia, that's part of the Washington, D.C. MSA, where I live in Arlington and Alexandria. Not a big surprise. That's due to consultant job cuts, government job cuts, and the like. 54% for Virginia compared to 55% for the U.S. The Virginia data looks an awful lot like the U.S. data as a whole. If you want to know some of the outliers, there's places in the Midwest that have only seen 20 or 30% home price growth since COVID. And then if you look at some of the really hot markets in the mountain states, some of the markets in Florida, you've got 60 to 70% home price growth. So when you hear things about home price cuts, and we think, by the way, most markets in the country over the next 12 months are going to see price declines, not price declines like we saw in 2008, but price declines. It is due to the fact that they're up 55, 60, 70%. Some give back as kind of a breather is absolutely required due to housing affordability conditions. Another concern that is coming up a lot is insurance pricing. I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but if you look at this map, you can see some of the places that have the highest insurance premiums on a per home basis. You have a few places in Virginia for this. Some of that is Northern Virginia, that's higher priced homes. But you've got coastal Virginia, for example, basically places close to water. But you can clearly see from a U.S. perspective, you got the hurricane area, tornado alley, fire risk in California. This is going to be an ongoing issue because insurance pricing is going to continue to rise. The market is creaking in terms of its ability to reflect not just the ongoing growth of the population. I mean, it's easy, cheap, and somewhat misleading to sort of blame this on things like climate change. Really, what's driving it, and I see this every time we see a rise in building material pricing. What's driving it is the same issues that drive builders nuts. It's more expensive to build and rebuild. In fact, every time lumber prices go up or we go into a cycle where lumber prices get up, the first people who call me are not journalists, not builders. It's my friends in the insurance industry. They want to know what's the cost to rebuild because that's going to affect their strategies when it comes to premium. So, that's another area where our advocacy efforts to build at lower cost could help solve some of the challenges that we see in the insurance market. And then just taking a look at the overall population growth numbers, again, I included 3 metro areas that overlap with Virginia. You can see the growth numbers are fairly solid. The Virginia numbers reflect what we see at the nation as a whole. Virginia Beach is a little bit slower, but these are still positive numbers. The numbers next year are going to look very different, and because these include legal and illegal individuals, we're probably looking at flat population trends due to immigration enforcement. And keep in mind, during the Biden years, and we had tens of millions of people come into the country that were not kind of based in our population projections. That is over. The border is effectively closed. So population growth in the U.S. is going to come from essentially births and deaths, the traditional sources of net population growth. And then housing affordability is a big issue. Something we've been watching is a number of young adults who live with their parents. It's roughly 20%. It's gone down in the last few years. Some of that is the post-COVID housing boom that allowed some construction of entry level. But if you compare these numbers to where we were in the year 2000, when it was closer to 10%, this remains a real issue. And in fact, I plotted this out state by state, and you can see for those 25 to 34-year-olds, 18% of them in Virginia live with their parents. And again, that's about a doubling of that share compared to about 25 years ago. So this is another area where, from an advocacy point of view, we're really concerned about that home ownership rate for younger Americans. So the American dream is just getting further out. And I think this is why policymakers are really focused on housing. My hope is, I'm not trying to kind of break any news here, but my hope is sometime in the next 2 to 3 months, we're going to see a detailed housing regulatory agenda from the Trump administration, ways that we can really convince state and local governments to get more effective, more efficient in terms of construction. All right, we'll take a look at the supply side, and then my forecast, and then happy to take some questions. Building material costs, you can kind of ignore everything but the last part of the slide. The numbers on the very right-hand side of the slide are total inputs to residential construction. You can see over the last 4 years, that's up about 34%. The item in the middle, power and distribution transformers, I still hear from builders, shows up in our surveys that is a tough item to get. Long waiting list, and you can see the pricing is up about 70% over that 4-year period. Lumber's one I got wrong. If you heard me at the Builder Show or at the start of the year, I thought lumber prices were going to go up this year because of tariffs. We haven't seen it yet. In fact, lumber has actually gone down because the demand for lumber, a single-family home building softened, has gone down. To be clear, the lumber tariffs are going up. We've got in place a 14% duty rate. That's going to go up to about 30% in the coming weeks. That's not the president. That's a Department of Commerce trade rep item. But what we're waiting for is the so-called Section 232 enforcement rules. This is like aluminum and copper and steel. The president has ordered a review of whether it's a national security risk to make our lumber in Canada. I don't agree with that, but we could see 25 or even 50% tariffs on top of the duties that are going to be 30%. So later this year, it is likely we're going to see a lot higher tariff and duty rates on lumber. That could push some upward pressure on lumber, particularly if we get an upswing with an expectation that we'll see more building in 2026. Labor, it's a little bit easier to get workers right now. Most builders will indicate the labor shortage on a real-time basis has gotten a little bit easing or entered into easing territory, but it's still tough. And over a year-by-year basis, even though we've seen the job openings rate fall, let's see, right now it's roughly at 2018 levels or so. We still had a labor shortage in 2018. So it's not as tight as it was in 2022. It remains a challenging issue, and it's important for all of us to continue on workforce development. And I'm not going to go through all this in detail, but something we did for our sister organization, the Home Builders Institute, trying to put a dollar figure on how big the labor shortage is. I won't walk you through the math, but this is a number that Ed Brady and his team in HBI has been using, about $11 billion a year problem. So that's another one of those things that we get to policymakers to emphasize how important it is to work on the labor shortage. You can't talk about labor without talking about immigration. 1 out of 3 workers in the construction industry are non-native born. In Virginia, it's a little bit below that. It's at kind of a 27% share in terms of immigrant workers. Now, that's agnostic on legal versus illegal, but you can see on the left-hand side some of the occupations that have particularly high worker shares. And the thing that we know that's happening right now is that the rate of enforcement has roughly tripled today compared to where it was back in March. So I'm hearing a lot more anecdotal evidence. We will continue to survey the industry, see if it's affecting things like people showing up to work sites and the rest, but this does appear to be a growing issue, and it is one to watch as we move forward. And then if you've seen any of my talks, you've seen some version of this slide before, but just a reminder, we continue to track the regulatory burden. Roughly 24% of the price of a single family home is made up in various kinds of regs, a lot of these showing up at the state and local level. I know the Trump administration has this study, and we do it every 5 years, 2016, 2021. The new version we've just started and will be published in 2026. Again, my hope is that number in red, that 23.8%, is a motivating thing for the Trump administration to work on the regulatory side of housing. I know they're really, really, really focused on that in terms of the work they're doing behind the scenes right now. And then NAHB's 10-point plan. This is just kind of where our lobbyists, regulatory experts, and lawyers are working on issues. A lot of the issues that we've talked about today. You can take a look at this a little bit later. All right, forecast, and then happy to take some questions. Multifamily construction, actually a bit of a surprise up this year. The Virginia data is very much consistent with the national data. We had 25% decline in national multifamily construction starts last year. This year, we think it's going to be up 10%. In fact, the revised forecast I'm working on right now can have it as high as 14% growth. Virginia's data a little bit more volatile there, particularly at the start of the year. But what's happening is we had a slump and a reset with multifamily, really began in 23, continued through 2024, and now kind of an uptick due to that increased demand of renters due to housing affordability conditions remaining quite tight. Switching over to single family, looking at the inventory levels, they are rising. You can see that at the end of the slide. The red is new construction, that's rising. The blue is resale, that's going up. And when you combine the two, we've got a combined month supply of about 5.2 months. Anything above 5 is enough to really kind of slow the market down. If we were to get to 6, you start to see broad-based and large price decline. So we've kind of now entered the period where inventory has risen enough that you're seeing builders pull back in 2025, and that's consistent with the data. So here it is. This is our single family starts forecast. We had a 7% increase last year. On the table, it says down 6. Our revised forecast, it's actually closer to 7 or 8%. That will be published relatively soon. So we've been chasing the forecast down this year. It's going to be a down year, transition year, but you can see the forecast. We think we're going to grow back to 1 million single family starts in 2026 and 2027. It just requires certainty, requires some additional income growth. This is where the tax policy will help. And if we could just move beyond some of the chaos and the drama with tariffs, I think that will really help get some stability. We'll start to see it in consumer confidence. But this year is going to be a down year for single family home building because of ongoing elevated interest rates. And that's the last piece of the puzzle. The Fed starts cutting, we'll get some downward pressure on mortgage rates, bring some of those buyers back, and that'll be good for the single family housing market. Looking at the local data, thus far through May, Virginia's down 10%, so it's a little bit more than the country as a whole. I put the year-to-date data in that chart. Keep in mind, particularly for smaller metro areas, the data is going to be more volatile, subject to more revisions. So larger markets probably a more accurate estimate thus far. But I thought it was interesting that Charlottesville's up 11% thus far this year. That was a bit good news. Richmond down 4. The DC area is likely, it's down 10. That's the one that's likely to continue to decline. Again, just due to thinking about DOGE and some of the government cuts, particularly the effect on the consulting industry in some of the outlying suburbs of DC. And then if you're interested in kind of the biggest markets in the country, I got my Ph.D. at Ohio State, so I'm a Big Ten guy. This is a really heavy market on SEC markets. So it's a lot of places in the South. And in fact, they're all down except Orlando. And Orlando had a tough year in 2024. So that's a bit of a kind of a rebound. Custom home building is roughly about 20% of the market. This is built on an owner's lot, a little bit more stable, less sensitive changes in interest rates. So it's kind of in a good position. It'll see some weakness, but not as much as the spec building market, which is experiencing weakness right now. And then remodeling. The remodeling market I have remained bullish on. Our remodeling sentiment indicators, remodelers are positive. We've had, a couple of quarters of some weakness, but year by year, the remodeling market continues to grow. Homeowners have more than $30 trillion in home equity. The housing stock is aging. You got more teardown construction occurring. I'm really bullish as we move forward on the remodeling market, and I think it will continue to expand. And then lastly, I kind of use this slide a lot, just kind of as a reminder of where we've been and where we're going. Because right now, the majority of new construction buyers are in Gen X. So Gen X is those individuals, as you can see on the slide, kind of aged upper 40s and in their 50s. The millennials, there's a huge number of them. The blue line tracks how many people are at each age range. And as the millennials age into their 40s, or more of them into their 40s, the demand for single family homes is going to remain fairly solid. Where there is weakness, and you can see this at the back end of Gen Z, where the numbers begin to fall off, and then Gen Alpha, which is the smallest generational group in more than a century, the demand for housing is going to weaken. So in a lot of our long run projections, if you're talking about a decade from now, we do see a drop off in single family home building, kind of a permanent shift down 20 to 25%. And that's because household formations in the late 2030 are going to be smaller than they are today. And you can see why it is Gen Z and Gen Alpha. So I know JD Vance and others have talked about this. The fertility rate in the US right now is 1.6. To be flat, it's got to be 2.05. So it's been the case since the Great Recession that we are not having enough kids. So what we really need to do is build more entry-level homes, incentivize marriage, and have a few more children for the housing market to really be strong in the late 2030s. And with that, Craig and team, I'm happy to turn it back over to you and take any questions. As I said before, I'll make sure that a PDF copy of the deck is available. But the headlines here are soft start of the year, a lot of transition effects. Not a big fan. Tariffs and some of the immigration stuff from a pure parochial housing area, but I do think we've got some good news that the Fed is going to cut rates in the near term.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Dietz. Very well done, even with the dreaded summer cold. So
Yeah, that's right.
we appreciate you sticking with us through there. I don't see any questions in the chat, so why don't we do this? As everybody is thinking of their questions, well, we have one Q&A. Here we go. We do have one. At what level percentage tariffs on consumer goods do companies quit absorbing the tariff cost and begin to pass the cost increase to consumers? Is
That's
our
a great
first question.
question. I was just reading some academic research. So academic means theoretical. So take it for what it is with a big grain of salt. But once you get to about like a 30% tariff rate, then companies kind of have to make a bigger decision of not only timing, but scale. So right now, if you know the average tariff rate in the United States right now is about 14%. A year ago, it was like 2.5. That's a big jump, but a 14% rate is not huge, right? It's a big change from what we experience. But there is the ability for a lot of these companies, and like I said, some of the estimates indicate 2/3 of the tax is going straight out of profit margins. And they can do that. Now, the question is, are they doing that for economic reasons or are they doing that for political reasons? Nobody wants to be in the position like the car companies were 2 months ago when they said, we're raising prices. What did the president do? He went on True Social and ordered them not to raise their prices. Now, first of all, he can't do that, but he's an expert at using the bully pulpit. But I would say if you were looking at the average tariff rate doubling from where it is today, so from 14 to 30, you would start to see a marketable impact on higher prices. It would clearly show up in the inflation data. It wouldn't be like this morning's inflation data where you had to really zoom in on a particular item to say there's evidence for it. It's not been too bad. And this comes from somebody who is not a fan of tariffs. I don't like them. I don't think they're particularly efficient. I don't think you grow economies by raising taxes. But
Right.
if we had to go through a tariff issue, I think we're kind of in the easy pass lane right now, and we'll have to see, how it moves forward. The risk factor is China. There's kind of these 90-day extensions. We cannot have greater than 100% tariffs on China. If we do, we're going to have supply chain issues, and it's really going to affect household goods. So, how do we get to a more equitable, more fair position with Chinese trade that doesn't crush the consumer? That's what the president and his team are working on.
Okay. The next question is what conditions tend to influence the 10-year Treasury yield?
Yeah, so if you think about what the Fed controls the federal funds rate. That's the overnight rate. That's set by Fed policy. The 10-year Treasury rate is a long-term rate, and it's really a function of growth expectations, which sounds backwards, but more GDP growth pushes the 10-year Treasury rate higher. It's a function of Fed policy, so the short end of the curve being higher tends to push the long-term rates higher. It's not one for one, but that's why if the Fed cuts, we get an indirect effect pushing things down. And then the third factor that pushes the 10-year Treasury rate up is inflation expectations. This is the one that's hard to control. So if the Fed were to, let's say, just dramatically cut rates from where they are now, above 4.25% on the Fed funds rate down to 0.5%, the bond market would say, oh, the US government doesn't care about inflation anymore. And long-term rates would go up despite the fact that the short end of the curve went down. Why? Inflation expectations. The other part of inflation expectations comes from fiscal policy. This is why I talked about the debt to GDP ratio. The more money the government plans to spend on things like government spending and entitlements like Social Security, the higher the risk that the Fed will turn the printing presses on, generate cash, and that generates inflation. So it's a tricky business. I often feel like I'm sometimes defending an institution that I often criticize, which is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is cleaning up a mess that was created by pumping too much stimulus into the U.S. economy during COVID. We pumped 8-9 trillion. The Fed's pulling that back. Now, I don't think I think they should have cut a while ago, but nonetheless, the long-term objective of what they're trying to do does help us because If you don't have inflation expectations controlled, the 10-year treasury rate would be a lot higher, as with the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. And that's why, if you're looking for a win-win, putting guardrails or slowing the growth of government spending is the key to keeping mortgage interest rates moderated. So that's a great question. It is what myself, Ken Wingert, our Chief Advocacy Officer, Jim Tobin, and discussions with the state and local EOs in terms of our advocacy issues is, can we encourage a growth of government spending to be more moderate, because that would help long-term interest rates.
Right. Great. I do not see any additional questions. So before we wrap up, we've got a couple more slides. I just would like to.
Oh, yeah, I'll stop sharing.
No, you're. Oh yeah, you just.
There we go.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Dr. Dietz.
Sure thing.
Again,
Yeah.
you're all over the airwaves and the news media, and thank you for what you're doing and NHB is doing, both on getting the message out about what really impacts the housing market, and also what your team, Ken and Jim Tobin and everybody else, are doing up there in DC for us advocacy wise.
Right.
For all you Virginia members, don't forget to save the date, or actually go ahead and register for the Virginia Builders Summit, which is Tuesday, September 30th here at the Richmond Marriott downtown. This is our one-day trade show and education program for builders, remodelers, really anybody who's in the residential construction and development industry. So please sign up. We do have our keynote speaker is Rhonda Conger, who is the author and the vice president of CBH Homes. We'll have over 70 exhibitors. And go ahead and flip to the next slide. We have a great lineup of education sessions. We'll have our annual Virginia Uniform Statewide Building Code update. We will have 2 sessions on AI, one as a beginner course and one as kind of a next level course of AI. We'll have our design trends panel and many more. So please go ahead and register. It's Tuesday, September 30th. We'd love to see everybody in Richmond that day for the Virginia Builders Summit. With that, just again, thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to Dr. Dietz. I know you're very busy and high demand. And thank you to all of our members for tuning in and engaging with HBAV. I hope everybody has a great afternoon. Thank you.